December 4th, 1872. The Atlantic, roughly 400 miles from Gibraltar. The sea is calm, the sky clear. A merchant brigantine crew spots a ship ahead, drifting under partial sail, moving in an odd, uneven pattern, as if no one is at the helm. They draw closer. They call out. No one answers. When the boarding party finally climbs aboard, they find a ship in near-perfect order. The cargo is intact. Food and water remain in the galley. A sewing machine sits mid-stitch on a table as though someone stepped away moments ago. There is no sign of a struggle, no sign of fire, storm damage, or piracy. And there is no one on board at all. This is the story of the Mary Celeste, one of the most thoroughly documented and most enduringly unexplained mysteries in maritime history. The ship herself had an unremarkable history before that voyage. Built in Nova Scotia in 1861 under a different name, she had passed through several owners and a series of minor misfortunes, groundings, a change of registry, a fire early in her career, before coming under American ownership and being renamed Mary Celeste. By 1872, she was a modest, well-maintained two-masted brigantine, roughly 100 feet long, used for transporting bulk cargo across the Atlantic. That November, she set sail from New York bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial alcohol, unfit for drinking, intended for fortifying wine in Italian markets. Her captain was Benjamin Briggs, an experienced and highly respected mariner from a well-known seafaring family in Massachusetts. Briggs was known among his peers as careful, sober, and unlikely to panic or abandon a sound vessel without serious cause. He brought his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, along for the voyage, not unusual for captains of the era on a relatively routine crossing. His young son, from a previous stay ashore, remained behind with relatives. The crew numbered 7, a mix of experienced sailors, several of them German nationals with strong professional reputations. By every account available in the historical record, this was a competent, sober crew, aboard a seaworthy ship, under an experienced and cautious captain. Nothing in Briggs's background suggested recklessness. Nothing in the ship's condition suggested she was in danger. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed New York Harbor. She was never seen under command of her original crew again. Roughly a month later, on December 4th, a British brigantine named the Dei Gratia, captained by David Morehouse, spotted the Mary Celeste adrift in open water. Morehouse and Briggs were, by several historical accounts, acquainted, two captains who moved in overlapping professional circles, which would later fuel speculation, though no documented evidence ever tied Morehouse to wrongdoing. Morehouse sent a boarding party across. What they found became one of the most exhaustively examined crime scenes in maritime history, precisely because so much of it was carefully documented by the men who first set foot on her deck. The ship's sails were partially set, some torn, in a configuration consistent with having weathered rough conditions at some point, though nothing catastrophic. The wheel was unattended, spinning loosely. Below deck, the crew's personal belongings, clothing, valuables, even a set of oilskin boots, were left behind, undisturbed. The captain's cabin held family belongings, including toys, still in place. A sword was found in the captain's cabin, later noted to have faint discoloration on the blade, a detail investigators considered and ultimately ruled did not indicate violence, though it fueled speculation for over a century afterward. The ship's single lifeboat, which would normally have been stowed on deck, was missing, along with the ship's papers, the captain's navigational instruments, and the chronometer. The last log entry, made 9 days before the ship was found, placed the Mary Celeste roughly 400 miles from where she was ultimately discovered, a substantial but not impossible drift for an unmanned vessel over that span of time, given prevailing currents and weather in the region. There was water in the ship's hold, not an alarming amount for a wooden vessel of her age and type, but enough that a working pump, found disassembled on deck, had apparently been in use shortly before the crew vanished. Several barrels of the alcohol cargo, when later inspected in Genoa, were found empty. 9 of the 1,700, made of a more porous wood than the rest, a detail later investigators considered significant. No bodies were ever found, no wreckage, no debris, no personal effects were recovered from the surrounding sea. The Mary Celeste herself was towed to Gibraltar, entirely seaworthy, essentially undamaged, carrying no crew at all. The Gibraltar Admiralty Court's inquiry into the case became, in its own right, a significant historical document. The court's proctor, Frederick Solly Flood, approached the case with open suspicion from the outset, at points suggesting the crew of the D.I. Gracia may have murdered Briggs's crew for salvage rights, or that Briggs and Morehouse may have conspired together in an insurance fraud scheme. The inquiry examined the sword stains, which were ultimately determined not to be blood. It examined the barrels, the pump, the sails, and every crew member's known background in the hope of finding evidence of mutiny, piracy, or foul play. No conclusive evidence of any crime was ever produced. The court ultimately awarded the De Gracia's crew a salvage payment, but a notably reduced one, reflecting lingering official suspicion that was never formally substantiated. No one was ever charged. No solution was ever officially recorded. The file, much like the Sodder case 70 years later on a different continent, closed without resolution. In the absence of an official answer, theories began to multiply almost immediately. Some grounded closely in the physical evidence, others considerably more speculative. The most widely credited theory among modern maritime historians centers on the alcohol cargo. Denatured alcohol, unlike drinking alcohol, can produce vapor under certain conditions that, in a hot cargo hold, may have raised concern among the crew about a possible explosion, even without any actual fire or blast occurring. If the crew, alarmed by fumes, pump readings, or the sound of shifting barrels, believed the ship was in imminent danger of exploding, an orderly, non-panicked evacuation into the lifeboat, tied by a length of rope to the ship, intending to wait at a safe distance until conditions settled, becomes a plausible, though unproven, explanation. If that line then broke or was cut loose in worsening weather, the crew would have been left adrift in an open boat, in an ocean, with a ship sailing on without them. This theory accounts for a great deal: the missing lifeboat, the missing papers and instruments, the disassembled pump, the empty barrels, and the complete absence of a struggle. It does not, however, explain everything with certainty, and no wreckage or remains from a lifeboat were ever recovered to confirm it. Other theories, considered by historians with varying degrees of credibility, have included a sudden and severe storm event that caused a temporary panic later corrected once conditions passed, leaving the crew adrift. A waterspout or similar localized weather phenomenon that may have caused instrument malfunctions, suggesting the ship was taking on more water than it actually was. And, at the far more speculative end of the spectrum, theories involving piracy, mutiny, sea monsters, or paranormal explanations that gained popularity in later fictionalized retellings but carry no support in the documented historical record. It's worth noting how significantly the case was distorted in the decades after the actual inquiry. A short story published in 1884 by a young writer, later famous under the name Arthur Conan Doyle, fictionalized the case heavily, inventing dramatic details that had no basis in the historical record, including a fabricated sole survivor and an entirely invented backstory. That story was widely read and often mistaken for fact, and many of the more sensational elements associated with the Mary Celeste in popular culture, solved mysteries, single culprits, a haunted or cursed vessel, trace back not to the 1872 inquiry, but to that piece of fiction and the many retellings that followed it. The documented record itself remains considerably more restrained and considerably less resolved than the popular legend suggests. What the Gibraltar inquiry actually established was this: a competent crew, under a cautious and experienced captain, aboard a fundamentally sound ship, made a decision, under circumstances never fully reconstructed, to leave that ship in open ocean. They did not return. Nothing else about their fate was ever confirmed. The Mary Celeste herself continued sailing under new ownership for another 12 years after the incident, developing a reputation among sailors as an unlucky vessel, though this was likely reinforced by hindsight rather than anything demonstrably unusual about the ship's later performance. She was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti in 1885, in what was later established, through a separate legal proceeding, to have been an act of insurance fraud by her final owner, an entirely unrelated crime, decades after the original disappearance, that nonetheless added one more strange chapter to an already unusual ship's history. To this day, no confirmed account of what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, or his crew has ever been established. Historians and maritime investigators continue to revisit the case using modern understanding of period ships, cargo chemistry, and Atlantic weather patterns, refining which theories remain plausible and which do not. But no new physical evidence has emerged since 1873, and none is likely to. The Atlantic Ocean, in this case, kept its evidence, if it kept any at all. What the Mary Celeste case reveals, much like other enduring unsolved mysteries, is the particular difficulty of investigating an absence rather than a crime scene. There was no body, no weapon, no confession, no witness, only a ship in order, and 7 adults and 1 child who were never seen again. The Gibraltar court did everything a formal maritime inquiry could reasonably do with the evidence available, and still arrived at no answer. That gap between diligent investigation and genuine resolution is, in many ways, the most enduring part of the story, more enduring ultimately than any single theory about what happened that November. It also reveals something about how mysteries survive in public memory. The actual documented case, restrained and largely inconclusive, has spent a century and a half competing with a far more dramatic fictional version most people have actually absorbed. Separating the two requires returning, again and again, to primary sources. Ship's logs, inquiry transcripts, salvage records, rather than the version repeated in film and popular retellings. Consider the timeline more closely, because it is unusually well preserved for a case this old. The Mary Celeste's log was kept meticulously up until November 25th, 9 days before the day Gratia's crew found her adrift. The final entry recorded her position near Santa Maria Island in the Azores, still on a normal expected course toward the Strait of Gibraltar. Whatever happened to the crew, it happened sometime in that 9-day gap, in conditions calm enough by the time of discovery that the investigators aboard the Dei Gratia found no storm damage consistent with a violent, ship-threatening event at the moment of abandonment. That calm discovery is part of what makes the case so difficult to close. A shipwreck leaves wreckage. A mutiny leaves signs of struggle. A pirate attack leaves missing cargo or valuables. The Mary Celeste offered none of these. Her cargo, beyond the 9 empty alcohol barrels, remained fully accounted for and was later delivered intact to its consignee in Genoa. Valuables belonging to the crew, including a considerable sum of money in the captain's cabin, were left entirely untouched, a detail the Admiralty inquiry treated as strong evidence against both piracy and robbery, since no rational attacker would leave currency behind while stripping the ship of nothing else of comparable value. The German crew members aboard, several of them brothers, had documented histories as reliable, professional sailors cited by previous employers without incident. Investigators pursuing the mutiny theory found no supporting evidence in the men's backgrounds, no history of conflict aboard, and no plausible motive ever established. Captain Briggs himself came from a family with 3 generations of sea captains, and his own conduct on previous voyages was, by every surviving account, careful and exacting rather than reckless. This is part of why the case unsettled contemporary investigators so thoroughly. It did not fit the profile of any disaster they were used to categorizing. A reckless captain might explain an accident. A troubled crew might explain a mutiny. Neither applied here, as far as the documented record could establish. In the weeks following the ship's arrival in Gibraltar, naval surveyors conducted a detailed physical examination of the hull, searching for evidence of a collision, an explosion, or structural failure that might explain a sudden evacuation. They found the hull essentially sound, some old and unremarkable damage consistent with ordinary wear, but nothing suggesting the ship had ever been in danger of sinking. This finding directly undercut the theory, popular in the press at the time, that the crew had panicked over a genuinely sinking ship. Whatever the crew believed was happening to the Mary Celeste, the physical evidence suggests it was not, in fact, actually happening, which points investigators back toward the alcohol vapor theory, a crew reacting to a perceived, rather than an actual, catastrophic threat. Search efforts in the immediate aftermath were limited by the practical realities of 1870s Atlantic shipping. There was no coordinated international search operation of the kind a modern disappearance would prompt. Word of the Mary Celeste's discovery spread through shipping offices and newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic over the following weeks, and various vessels passing through the region were asked to watch for wreckage, a lifeboat, or survivors. None was ever reported. Given the size of the Atlantic and the several-week head start any drifting lifeboat would have had before searchers even knew to look, the absence of a recovery is not itself unusual, but it permanently foreclosed the possibility of a definitive answer. The Gibraltar inquiry stretched on for more than 3 months, considerably longer than typical salvage hearings of the period, precisely because Solly Flood remained convinced some deliberate wrongdoing was being concealed. He commissioned additional chemical testing on the sword stains, ultimately identified as not blood at all. He questioned Morehouse and his crew repeatedly regarding their prior acquaintance with Briggs, searching for any indication of a coordinated fraud, and found none that satisfied the court. By the time the inquiry concluded in March 1873, the presiding judge acknowledged, in terms that survive in the court record, that the case remained mysterious, that no evidence of criminality had been established against anyone involved, and that the true cause of the crew's disappearance could not be determined from the evidence available. That finding, that a formal, extensive judicial inquiry, conducted while the physical evidence was still fresh, could not determine what happened, is itself one of the most significant documented facts of the case. It has not been superseded by any later investigation. No 20th or 21st century inquiry has uncovered new physical evidence. What has changed is only the sophistication of the theoretical modeling brought to bear on the same 19th century facts. More than 150 years later, the Mary Celeste remains one of the most carefully documented unsolved cases in maritime history, not because no one investigated, but because the investigation, however thorough, ran directly into the limits of what physical evidence alone can prove. No wreckage from a lifeboat has ever surfaced. No log entry explains the final decision. No account survives from anyone who was aboard that ship in her final hours under her original crew. The gap between the documented record and the popular legend is worth dwelling on a little further, because it shaped how the case has been understood for generations. Arthur Conan Doyle's 1884 story, published under a different ship name but transparently based on the Mary Celeste, was written and marketed as fiction. Yet many readers at the time and since have mistaken its invented details for established fact. Doyle's version introduced a sole survivor discovered aboard, elaborate motives involving a formerly enslaved crew member seeking revenge, and other dramatic embellishments entirely absent from the Gibraltar inquiry record. The story was commercially successful, republished widely, and its details bled steadily into later journalism, further dramatized retellings, and eventually into film and television treatments across the 20th century. By the time later generations encountered the case, they were often encountering Doyle's fiction, several removes and embellishments deep, rather than the considerably more restrained facts established by the 1873 Admiralty Court. This matters for a documentary grounded in the public record, because it means correcting the popular version is itself part of telling the story honestly. There was no survivor found aboard. There was no confirmed act of violence. There was no confirmed monster, storm, or supernatural event. There was a competent crew, a sound ship, an ambiguous set of physical clues, and a formal inquiry that ultimately admitted defeat in the face of those clues. Separating that documented reality from a century and a half of embellishment is not a minor footnote to the case. It is, in many ways, the central discipline required to discuss it responsibly at all. Modern maritime historians who have revisited the case in recent decades have generally converged, cautiously, around the alcohol vapor evacuation theory as the most internally consistent explanation available, while stopping short of calling it proven. Laboratory recreations of denatured alcohol vapor behavior in wooden cargo holds, conducted decades after the original incident, have demonstrated that such vapor can produce a visible mist, or even a minor, non-destructive ignition under specific conditions, enough, potentially, to alarm an experienced captain into ordering a temporary, precautionary evacuation without any of the more dramatic elements popular fiction later supplied. If this reconstruction is correct, the crew's disappearance was not the result of any external attack, mutiny, or catastrophe at all, but a fatal miscalculation made in a moment of caution. A decision to leave a fundamentally safe ship for reasons that seemed sound at the time, that could never be corrected once made. That possibility, if true, would make the Mary Celeste less a story of violence or malice, and more a story of an ordinary, understandable human error, magnified by the unforgiving conditions of the open ocean, and preserved for a century and a half specifically because no one ever survived to explain it. It remains, however, exactly what it has always been in the documented record: the most plausible working theory, not a confirmed solution. If cases like this, where meticulous documentation still leaves the central question unanswered, are the kind of history you want more of, consider following this channel, where every documentary stays grounded strictly in the public record and every unresolved mystery is presented exactly as it remains, unresolved.